Good evening and welcome to what was to be the second of the Edmund J. Safra Center's events for the second term of this year. The first event, however, was canceled because of snow. Everyone except for our loyal Dr. Korn learned of that in time. So he alone attended the last lecture. Maybe you can tell us how it was, Dr. Korn. But Larissa McFarquhar will be with us on February 25th, and so you should be on the list to learn when and exactly where, but I hope to see you then. But I'm incredibly happy tonight to be able to welcome Jeff Connaughton to Harvard. Jeff is the author of The Payoff, The Way Wall Street Always Wins. If you read his biography, it says that he is, quote, retired from politics. I'm not sure whether the advance on the book made retirement possible or whether the substance of the book made retirement necessary. For, as you'll hear this evening, the work is a pretty damning critique of the way that Washington works, a critique that's not unfamiliar to people around this place, crafted by someone on the inside willing, as he put it, to, quote, burn every bridge. I came to D.C., Connaughton writes, a Democrat. I left a plutocrat. Now he's just a Georgian, as in from Savannah, not from Tbilisi, with the good grace to travel to this place from a place where it's now 80 degrees and sunny. Jeff Connaughton began his career on Wall Street after graduating from the University of Alabama in 1981 and then University of Chicago Business School in 1983. He worked for 4 years at Smith Barney and then E.F. Hutton. In 1987, he got a chance to work for someone he had met while at Alabama and admired, at least at the time, greatly, Senator Joe Biden. He worked for Biden's 1988 presidential campaign, and after that campaign failed, he went to work for the senator's staff. In 91, he traveled to California to attend the Stanford Law School. He clerked for Judge Mikva in the D.C. Court of Appeals, and then traveled with Mikva to the White House when Mikva was appointed counsel to the president under Bill Clinton, where he worked with Elena Kagan. After the White House, then he went for a brief time to Covington and Burling, and then in 2000 started his own lobby shop with Jack Quinn and Ed Gillespie, and quickly became one of DC's premier lobbying firms. For a brief time in 2008, he worked again with Senator Biden on Biden's PAC, tried to work for Vice President Biden, but because he was a lobbyist and Obama's lobbying rules forbid that, he had to resign. And that led him to work for the man who replaced Joe Biden in the United States Senate, Ted Kaufman. And he tried to help Senator Kaufman craft an amendment or a reform to the Dodd-Frank financial reform that would have included a pretty critical provision to facilitate the breakup of big banks. He failed at that. And from reading the account, it's perhaps that failure that finally pushed him over the line from an insider trying to make the system work, at least for the clients he had on the inside, to an outsider, the sort of person who spends his time trying to explain to the world as an author just how broken their government is. Now, as a member of that world, the world of people trying as an author to explain to the world how broken their government is, I can affirm that it's not quite as lucrative as a partnership with Quinn, nor as powerful as a senior staffer on Capitol Hill. Perhaps we sleep better, or perhaps we don't sleep better as we're focused on a problem that most in DC seem obsessed to ignore. But regardless, I'm incredibly happy to welcome him to Harvard, and even more than that, grateful for his work, because the story he tells, and I think the account he'll give us tonight, is a story that we believe, obviously, many more people need to understand firsthand from someone who has a very clear picture of what is not happening in Washington now. So, Jeff, I'd like to welcome you to Harvard.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Lessig, for that introduction. It really is gratifying to be invited to speak here at the Safra Center for Ethics and to be at Harvard Law School for the first time, I might add. And thank you also to Sheila Kaplan, who reached out to me months ago, and Katie Evans-Pritchard for coordinating. And thank you to the audience for coming tonight. And I want to give a special shout out in the audience to my Boston area Twitter acquaintance, I Ate Wamu, who is here but prefers to remain anonymous. But he has 5 times the number of Twitter followers I have, so maybe he should be up here speaking. I'm going to talk about why Wall Street always wins. It was a title for my book that I would assert is literally true, perhaps depending only on the time horizon. It was a bit misleading for my book because it's really a memoir, the unvarnished truth through my eyes and through my perceptions of how D.C. works. The other 2 titles I considered for my book were Goodbye to Washington, It's Okay to Burn Your Bridges When You're Too Afraid You May Go Back, and the second was Mutiny from the Bounty. Because just like the mutiny mountaineers, I knew I had to set fire to the ships that might take me back to D.C. because there's just too much money and temptation. So while I arrived by airplane, I had to burn my bridges and my ships to get to the Safra Center for Ethics. I do have no conflicts of interest. I didn't make a dime off of my book. In fact, I've lost about $20,000 subsidizing the attempt to market it. Since I am at the Center for Ethics, I guess I should disclose in the interest of transparency that for the past 3 years I've been living off quantitative easing. You should bear that in mind if we discuss the Federal Reserve. I'm going to speak for 50 minutes. The short version is, as Senator Dick Durbin once said, frankly, the banks own the place. So why don't we break here for those of you who don't want to stay for the longer version. The longer version begins, it's very hard to tell people something about Washington that they didn't already know or strongly suspect. In fact, some of the people actually accused you of holding back on the really juicy stuff. But it's especially hard here where you've been studying it intensely for years and in front of Professor Lessig especially, who's written an excellent book, which I've read and which I greatly admire. Indeed, I don't think there's much left to say. All that's left is to try to change a corrupted system, to march across the length of New Hampshire in snow and ice. I got a small taste of what that might have been like today if I had joined you. Sorry about that. And to give people who participate in an early presidential primary the hope and the fortitude that it can be changed. I have to say Professor Lessig would have made a great lobbyist. Too often clients have the same strategy meeting over and over. They never get to an action plan that executes on the strategy. But that's exactly what he has done and is doing, and it's a privilege for me to be here. This talk has 2 parts based on my 23-year career in D.C., culminating as Senator Kaufman's Chief of Staff for 2 years in the aftermath of the financial crisis. 2 parts in the same way for me that I look at D.C. differently from before the financial crisis and after it. The first half is, yes, fundraising, lobbying, the way Congress operates, it all adds up to dependency, corruption, and that's bad. The second half is when the nation's legal and regulatory system have rotted to the point where the financial plutocracy can plunder the markets and live and prosper outside the bounds of the law, then you've really got yourself a serious problem. In the Q&A, I'll talk more about my years as a fundraiser and a lobbyist. After all, some of you may have read George Packer's take on me in The New Yorker or included in his book, The Unwinding. That was the way he sort of described me. A guy comes to Washington as a young idealist. He becomes steeped in the arts of fundraising. He goes through the revolving door. He becomes steeped in the arts of lobbying. Then he goes back into government after the financial crisis and is shocked to find that the money power that's grown substantially over the course of his career prevents the government from responding effectively to Wall Street recklessness and outright fraud. Well, I was shocked. I knew that D.C. was corrupted because as a lobbyist, I had helped put corporate America's thumb on the scale for years. On the book flap of The Unwinding, the description says, I was a, quote, Washington insider who oscillated between political idealism and the lure of organized money. Well, let me be the first to confess, I did some pretty fancy oscillating. In my 23 years in D.C., The corporate shower that rains money on all sectors of Washington grew from a downpour to a deluge. And in that kind of rainstorm, I succumbed to the temptation to turn my umbrella upside down. Parenthetically, we should expect corporate America to spend that kind of money because Washington makes decisions that affect individual corporations by millions of dollars, industry by billions, and the economy by trillions. So of course they see it as in their interest to flood the zone with cash. But as a lawyer, I didn't think our legal and regulatory system had devolved to the point where Wall Street megabanks could operate lawlessly without any individuals ever being held to account, with the exception of a junior trader at Goldman Sachs named Fabrice Touré. I claim some standing for saying this because my former boss, former Senator Kaufman, did more than anyone in Congress, both to try to give the Justice Department and FBI the resources they needed to investigate Wall Street fraud, and then, with the encouragement of Senate Judiciary Committee Chairman Pat Leahy, held 2 oversight hearings in 2009 and 2010 involving the leadership of the Justice Department, the FBI, and the SEC. While I'm proud of my contribution, let me say now, Ted Kaufman is the man. I don't speak for Ted, but his inspiration and determination were a model of what public service should be. But I too was paid by the American taxpayers. So while I haven't been in government for three years, in my view, I'm carrying forward an institutional oversight responsibility by continuing to talk about my 2 years of interaction with our nation's law enforcement leaders at a critical juncture of the post-crisis fraud enforcement response. And I want to be clear, it's that second half that led me to be here today. I'm not a lobbyist who woke up one day with a change of heart. After my 2 years in the Senate, I felt misled and gamed by the Justice Department. And I believe the failure of the leadership of the Obama Justice Department to adequately dedicate themselves in a timely manner to pursue Wall Street fraud amounts to a stain on the American justice system. If the Justice Department had made a sufficient effort either to bring criminal prosecutions against Wall Street individuals or to be remotely credible when talking to the Congress about the lack of such cases, or even had been generally honest with the American public about the hurdles they face in fulfilling all their various missions and priorities, I'd probably still be in Washington and a lobbyist today. Recently, even a sitting federal judge, Judge Rakoff, first in a speech to the City Bar Association of New York and then in the pages of the New York Review of Books, has written much the same thing, just not that part about still being a lobbyist. So back to dependency corruption. When Ted Kaufman, who I had known for 23 years because he had been Biden's chief of staff when I joined Senator Biden's staff, asked me to be his chief of staff in December 2008, I had a rare experience. I went back into government to work for an appointed senator who immediately said he wouldn't run in the special election 2 years hence. Ted and I were immune to the normal pressures. First, I had already made my money, so I didn't have to worry about my next job. I was 51 years old at the time. More importantly, Ted didn't have to raise money to get to the Senate or to try to stay. It was as though Professor Lessig had set up a control group for an experiment about Republic Lost. Indeed, in the spring of 2010, after Ted gave a series of blistering Senate floor speeches on Wall Street reform and the rule of law, Arianna Huffington wrote a glowing profile of Ted, saying he was an example of what we would get if we took money and fundraising out of politics. And after Ted really got up ahead of steam, we heard from reporters that Wall Street was frustrated that it couldn't get a grip on or find a restraining handle on Ted because he wasn't running for election. So let me tell you what it's like to be a United States Senator from the perspective of a chief of staff. A senator only has a vote, a pen, and a microphone in committee, on the floor, and on TV, and normally as a freshman, not even a gavel. So if you're going to have an impact, you've got to pick an issue and bulldog it. Indeed, you quickly realize that the senator and his chief of staff, for that matter, only have the bandwidth to take a deep dive into about 4 or 5 issues at any one time. And this was when there were so many things that we didn't have to do. We didn't have to set up a campaign apparatus because he wasn't running. We didn't have to start our every day at a breakfast fundraiser where we would have been pounded on by former Democratic office holders and staffers, now lobbyists, wanting us to be more reasonable about Wall Street. I know, I used to do that. We didn't have to make calls asking for money, spending as much as a quarter of your day, as many senators do, all of them. We didn't have to take calls from people who had given us money or bundled money, saying we were being ridiculous about the positions we were taking. In that sense, I didn't have to be a typical chief of staff, the traffic cop on the fundraiser lobbyist highway in and out of the senator's office. I could become a super banking legislative assistant, supervising the staff, but mostly adding to the staff efforts on Wall Street issues, meeting frequently with experts, and talking constantly to the media to help raise Ted's profile on these issues. In contrast, on healthcare reform, we mostly took the talking points from the majority leader's office, and Ted made a lot of very strong speeches because he wanted to be a good soldier on that issue for President Obama, and he believed in healthcare reform. But on Wall Street reform, Ted was a thought leader. We never waited to ask what we should think or say or fight for. Now, did I see evidence of corruption in the Senate? Well, of course not bags of cash handed over, no. And I never saw that when I was a lobbyist either. But let me tell you what I did see. Before Ted even asked me my view, he decided that he wanted to serve on the two same committees that Senator Biden had served on for so long, the Judiciary Committee and the Foreign Relations Committee, because those were the committees he knew so well. And as soon as I knew that he wasn't going to be on the Banking Committee, I knew we were going to have an awfully hard time having any impact on Banking Committee issues. In fact, I knew the way that lobbyists get leaks from staffers and from senators, intelligence basically about what's going on in the Banking Committee, because I often used to do that myself and send an email to the client, here's what I heard from Senator Dodd or the staffer for Senator so-and-so. The client typically would forward it on to the trade association, the Financial Services Roundtable would aggregate all this intelligence, and they'd email blast it out to pretty much every lobbyist on K Street who was representing the financial services industry. So with multiple leakers from the Banking Committee keeping K Street well informed, the banking world had complete transparency into bill drafting, while senators who didn't serve on the Banking Committee stayed mostly in the dark. At one point, I was having particular trouble getting information during the closed-door negotiations that Chairman Dodd was leading, bipartisan basis. So I called my former lobbying partner, and I said, I assume you're having a hard time getting information. And he said, I just took a CEO in to meet with Chris Dodd for 45 minutes yesterday. So I emailed one of my other chiefs of staff in the Senate, and I said, I just came into the Senate to have an influence on Wall Street reform, and I'm finding the profession I just left is having more influence than I am. And he responded, that's really sad. Another example is we got very deeply involved in market structure and high-frequency trading issues because we were concerned, and actually Ted predicted on the Senate floor 9 months before it happened, the flash crash of May 2010. But when I would call the SEC asking about their progress on pending rulemakings, the legislative people would say, Jeff, we can't talk to you about pending rulemakings. And then I would meet with industry officials, executives from UBS or from Goldman Sachs, and they'd tell me exactly what was going on over at the SEC. I was getting my best information from them because, of course, they were coming from meetings with the directors and the commissioners and the chairman. And after a year of studying high-frequency trading and putting together a 12-page letter describing the problems and presenting potential solutions, I took it over to the SEC's director of the Division of Markets and Trading, and I spent an hour going through it with him, trying to be as constructive and nice as I could be. And the minute I finished my hour-long presentation, the director of the SEC's Division of Markets and Trading said, gee, it's great to have someone in here who's not from Wall Street. And I called a friend of mine who used to work for the chairman, Bill Donaldson, when he was chairman of the SEC, and I told him the story. He said, Jeff, it's true. The only people who walk through the doors at the SEC are Wall Street people bitching about their proposals. So in brief, as I wrote in my book, Ted and I quickly learned that when you take on Wall Street in Washington, you take on the blob. The blob, I wrote, refers to the government entities that regulate the financial industry, like the Banking Committee, the Treasury Department, and the SEC, and the army of Wall Street representatives and lobbyists that continuously surrounds and permeates them. The blob moves together. Its members are in constant contact by email and phone. They dine, drink, and take vacations together. Not surprisingly, they frequently intermarry. And they normally will swap, well, not normally, but sometimes, the ideal way to maximize your family income in Washington is to marry a member of the blob, and while one of you is working in government, the other is working in industry. And the thing they do all the time is share information, because no restriction on lobbying that can ever be thought up can stop pillow talk. In other words, you're up against a deeply ingrained culture. Mark Patterson, a leading blob member who was chief of staff to Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner, I was told by a friend of mine when my name came up, well into Ted's tenure, said, yes, Jeff has taken a strong interest in issues outside his jurisdiction. I mean, think about that. I mean, Delaware may be a small state, but we are one of the 50 states. But that's not the only example I could give of the technocratic arrogance of the blob, that only we know these sophisticated, complex issues. And this, mind you, was after a devastating financial crisis in the lead up to which those very technocrats had failed miserably, causing massive wreckage to the economy. I began telling reporters, what we had was an abdication of regulatory responsibility leading to the financial crisis. Now we're having an abdication of democratic responsibility because the Treasury Department and the Fed don't want any senators to write any kind of hard lines in the statute. So every senator has limited bandwidth, and when it comes to banking issues, are naturally deferring to the Banking Committee. I mean, that's why the Senate has committees. But the Banking Committee, with a few notable exceptions, is absorbed within the blob, deluged with Wall Street contributions. And it's staffed by people mostly in their early 30s. I was just quoted last week in Washingtonian magazine saying, I can't say to these young staffers, don't worry about making money. And I was also quoted on Washington's social glue. I mean, there's just this pervasive feeling, if you play ball with the establishment, you'll do well. Recently, a Republican congressman got into trouble when he was overheard saying, I'm stuck here while my staffer leaves to go make $400,000 a year. And his constituents took that as an insult, but I knew exactly what he meant by it. I mean, and I actually believe that the revolving door has become as big a problem as fundraising. But even if you are on the banking committees, these committee staffers couldn't function without outside experts from the Fed, the Treasury, and particularly downtown law firms. And I'll have to admit, I never really understood what was in Dodd-Frank until I read a summary and analysis written by the law firm Davis Polk. Yesterday, I gave a quote to a reporter on so-called soft lobbying, where I said more and more, the value is in saying, look at the weight of expert opinion on this than it is about any one lobbyist walking through the door and making an argument. And of course, the banks are spending a lot of money to buy or cook the appearance of that expert opinion. I also got a call from a second reporter yesterday asking whether big asset management firms should be scrutinized for systemic risk, hedge funds. In a nation of 300 million people, I sometimes think that outside of the superb but extremely thinly staffed better markets and Americans for Financial Reform, there are really only about 20 or 25 people in the country who will talk critically of Wall Street on the record from a position of some authority or credibility. And this is pretty much my life in Savannah right now. I walk my dog while occasionally lobbing a hand grenade at Wall Street via my cell phone to a reporter. So when you're on K Street, you feel like you're part of an army with a Navy, Air Force, Marines, and CIA to help you. From K Street, you have almost complete transparency into the bill drafting process. And I was often in the loop when I was a lobbyist with the person writing the legislation or reacting to drafts. In contrast, when you're a reformer in Congress, you feel almost alone. Until eventually, and when it's too late, you team up with a small band of brothers and sisters for a fight in which the public interest is completely outgunned. So I repeat, did I see evidence of corruption in the Senate? I agree with Professor Lessig right down the line. Money creates the appearance of corruption, it sets the agenda, it sets the all-important starting point, and it skews outcomes. But for the argument's sake, let me raise 2 points. Michael Bennett was also an appointed senator, but he decided to run in the special election. Well, he raised a lot of money from Wall Street, and he also voted against the Brown-Kaufman amendment to break up the big banks. He also happened to have a Democratic primary opponent, a pretty well-known guy in Colorado. I think he was lieutenant governor at the time. And in that primary, the opponent to Michael Bennett campaigned against him, saying he raised a lot of money from the big banks, and he sided with the big banks against breaking up the big banks. So Michael Bennett had to defend his position. And he did defend his position, and he won the primary. So who am I to say that Michael Bennett is corrupt? I mean, neither Ted nor I would claim to have a monopoly on whether it's best to break up the banks or how to regulate the equity markets, for that matter. Let me give you another sort of counter notion. I mean, how much of Dodd-Frank turned out the way it did because of lobbyists versus it turned out to be exactly what Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner wanted? I think it was by far more of the latter. As I said to Sheila when she interviewed me a few months ago, and I think it's on the website here, I said, President Obama's financial reform policies reflected the worldview of Wall Street technocrats who had been brought into the Obama administration from the beginning. This man, who had been elected president on a change platform when it came to Wall Street issues, was all about appointing disciples of Bob Rubin, such as Larry Summers and Tim Geithner, the very architects of the financial crisis, and ensuring continuity with the bailouts and bank-friendly policies. It's no wonder that reformers in Congress made such little headway, because these administration officials were adamantly opposed to true structural reform. In our view, Dodd-Frank should have had structural reform done by clear, bright lines in statute. Instead, Dodd-Frank is not really a law in the way most people think of a law. It's a set of hundreds of instructions to regulators to write rules. Yes, we did get the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, and that was a huge victory. Yes, it finally regulated derivatives. That was essential. But most everything else, again, in my view, was a reshuffling of the regulatory deck, because that's the way the Treasury Department, the Fed, Barney Frank, and Chris Dodd wanted it. Secretary Geithner later, after we left the Senate, wrote a Wall Street Journal op-ed asking Wall Street to back off because Wall Street was clogging and fiercely opposing regulatory implementation of the bill. That Wall Street, according to Secretary Geithner, had a bad case of amnesia. Well, Ted and I couldn't help but laugh. I mean, by passing the buck back to the regulators to write hundreds of rules, the administration and Congress had played right into Wall Street's hands. Now, yes, the Democrats did pass Dodd-Frank, for what it's worth, so I always have to add, like a refrain after every stanza of criticism of the Democrats, the Republicans are even worse. It literally was chilling to watch them make a cold calculation to use the aftermath of a devastating financial crisis as a fundraising opportunity. In sum, for the first half of the speech, when it comes to Wall Street, we don't have a two-party system. We have an ongoing Wall Street contribution party, a cash bash that benefits Democrats and Republicans. This has two consequences. Neither party can creditably attack the other as too pro-Wall Street, and neither party is inclined to address needed structural reform or lawlessness in our financial markets. After my book was published, I was invited to visit the Wall Street Journal, and a reporter said to me, Jeff, on those two main points, that neither party is going to do anything about it because they're addicted to cash, and that we're never going to have, effective structural reform or prosecutions on Wall Street, not only are you right, but everyone in New York knows you're right. Now turning, I'm gonna hit the fast button because I want to finish and get to Q&A, but you know, I was watching the professor while he was down at Duke on the miracle of the web, giving his talk, and he talked about the duality of the word corruption. And there's also, and I tried to tease this out in my book, maybe not successfully, a duality of the word fraud, especially in Washington. Ted once said to me during the Biden presidential campaign, you know, I had turned to him and said, Ted, for a minute there, you almost had me believing we were going to win this thing. And Ted said, in a presidential campaign, if you're not faking it, you're dead. Well, the same can be said for lobbying, PR, and failing banks. I mean, that's what Lehman Brothers was doing right up until the very end. So there is fraud in D.C., but there's such a thing as statutory fraud, too, and it needs to be enforced. It was 5 years ago this week, Ted, in his very second speech on the Senate floor, the first one was on jobs and the stimulus, was on this subject. And I had called in 5 white-collar defense lawyers from my old firm, Arnold and Porter, 2 of whom were former Justice Department officials. And after that meeting with them in January of 2009, we could smell it coming. And here's what Ted said on the floor. I have heard people say prosecutors must tread carefully, that the law is a blunt instrument. They will say that if we turn prosecutors loose on our key financial institutions, the economic repercussions will outweigh any benefits. To that I say, of course we must be judicious, but the law of the land applies to everyone. And when it is pointed at you, the law always can be characterized as a blunt instrument. At the end of the day, this is a test of whether we have one justice system in the country or 2. If we do not treat a Wall Street firm that defrauded investors of millions of dollars the same way we treat someone who stole $500 from a cash register, then how can we expect our citizens to have any faith in the rule of law? Now, maybe Ted and I were being historically naive. Maybe we've always had 2 justice systems in this country, and this was a bizarre third one. But I had just never stared this reality so directly in the face. As I said, you know, Kaufman, more than anyone in Congress, took the lead in congressional authorization and oversight. We passed, with Chairman Leahy and Senator Grassley, the one Republican who deserves to be applauded for his attention to these issues, what was known as the Fraud Enforcement Recovery Act, which authorized $165 million for additional investigators and prosecutors, and it was signed by the President into law in May 2009. And there was Ted, a freshman senator, on the stage with the President of the United States. We thought we were making progress. And throughout the legislative consideration, we made it clear to the FBI and to the Department, do not come back in 2 or 3 years with statistics about how many small fry you put in jail. This is about high-level Wall Street securitizations. Now, I'm not going to repeat my book about the private meetings we had with the Justice Department and the FBI, but I will use the language that Ted and his chief counsel, also on the staff, himself a former assistant U.S. attorney who had more than a decade of experience as a federal prosecutor, used on the PBS Frontline episode a year ago that some of you may have seen. They said, not me, it was clear to us the department was not yet on top of the situation. And it was clear that the FBI was aiming too low. Now, I would say 10 months after Attorney General Holder had promised at his swearing-in ceremony that he would make this a priority, it was absolutely clear to us that the department had started out completely passive and flat-footed. But at the first hearing, they said all the right things. You know, they formed a task force, which our hearing caused them to form, so they could have some kind of dog and pony to talk about at the hearing. We're on it. These cases take time. You know, we're undertaking a thorough and robust investigation. Stay tuned. So we thought we had done good oversight. And then the months went by, and the Lehman Brothers bankruptcy examiner report came out, where the bankruptcy examiner found, you know, this looks like actionable balance sheet manipulation, Lehman Brothers' use of Repo 105. Senator Levin moved forward with his hearings, which were absolutely devastating on the rampant fraud at WAMU and on Goldman Sachs at the securitization level. The Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission, which the Leahy-Grassley-Kaufman bill had established, moved forward with its hearings. And, to us, it was like, look, wherever competent independent fact finders look at the financial crisis, they find evidence of what sure looks like fraud. Yet there are no cases coming forward. So Ted wanted a second shot at the leadership of the Justice, FBI, and SBI, and the SEC before he left office. So Chairman Leahy allowed him to hold a second hearing in September 2010. Now, at this hearing, I was sitting behind Ted, and I literally had to stop myself from rolling my eyes. There was really only one central question which the Justice Department witness, the Assistant Attorney General for the Criminal Division, consistently dodged. Did the department plan, fund, staff, and direct a timely and concerted investigation of each of the primary potential defendants? And it was clear that DOJ was out of the game in 2010 and that the SEC was going forward with civil suits. Yet the Assistant Attorney General continued to assure us that there was a thorough and robust investigation underway. Well, now we all know the first task force was a complete and utter sham. After we left office, Senator Grassley, at a hearing on the task force in the summer of 2011, said, "I've heard from people in the field it's nothing more than a press release collection agency." And the U.S. attorney who was representing the task force didn't deny that. He said, "We look for cases to highlight that have deterrent value." And then the president, in his 2012 State of the Union address, announced a second task force, a tacit admission that the first one had been nothing more than a mirage. Yet in February 2012, Attorney General Holder gave a speech at Columbia in which he said, "I am pleased to report that our record of success has been nothing less than historic." Since President Obama launched it in 2009, the task force has been a model of success. Since its creation, the work of the task force has resulted in charges and sentences against CEOs, CFOs, corporate owners, board members, presidents, general counsels, and other executives of Wall Street firms, hedge funds, and banks involved in financial fraud activities. When I saw that, I thought, General Holder, there are people who pay attention to what you say and what you do, and they sometimes don't match. Even worse, in the fall of 2012, in the lead up to the election, the Justice Department released completely false statistics about fraud conviction rates, and 9 months later, in 2013, they were forced to correct them. In August 2013, a Bloomberg columnist named Jonathan Ryle ran a column entitled "Attorney General Holder Owes the American People an Apology." Originally, the Justice Department said 530 people were charged criminally, and again, these are all small fry, as part of a year-long initiative by the Multi-Agency Mortgage Fraud Working Group. It now says the actual figure was 107, or 80% less. So I heavily criticized the Justice Department in my book. And when it came out, a reporter said to me, "There's a 20-year veteran of the fraud division in the criminal division of the Justice Department who wants to talk to you." And I was like, "Oh, really?" Okay. So I called him with some trepidation, fearing he might ream me out for insulting the integrity of the Justice Department. And he said to me, "You nailed it. I want to buy you lunch." He said, "There is nothing like a serious effort underway. The Assistant Attorney General is overly fearful of losing. Sometimes you just have to bring indictments, but we can't get out of the starting gate," or something to that effect. So I put him in touch with the producers of the PBS Frontline show, and he brought along with him another insider from the criminal division, and those were the two sources that allowed Martin Smith's interview, if you saw it, of Lanny Brewer to be so devastating. So while the department is claiming a record of a historic success, the nation is watching episodes of PBS Frontline where they're literally interviewing dozens of whistleblowers who said, "We saw rampant evidence of fraud in mortgages. Were you ever contacted by a federal law enforcement official? No, not a single one." 60 Minutes had an episode where they had a countrywide compliance official who was saying on 60 Minutes that fraud at Countrywide was systemic. Have you ever been questioned by the FBI? No. So yes, there were a series of civil settlements by the SEC, and last fall, we all know, a large J.P. Morgan civil settlement, and there's talk today of a possible additional round of civil settlements led by the Justice Department. This is checkbook justice. This is like making the banks go through a toll booth. I mean, first the SEC made them go through a toll booth, insert your shareholder debit card here, and now the Justice Department, because of public pressure, is going to make them go through a toll booth again. And as many have said, it actually incentivizes additional fraud by those inside the big banks who can profit from it. Okay, so what happened? And I'm going to wrap this up quickly, but I'm going to hit the highlights of Judge Rakoff's speech. He said the Justice Department is making excuses, I'm paraphrasing, that don't hold water. First, Justice Department says it's difficult to prove intent because disclosures are buried in the documents. And that is true. But as Judge Rakoff reminded us all, there are also other theories the department could have pursued based on willful blindness, unconscious disregard. If you have a growing amount of suspicious activity reports about fraud happening in mortgages, that perhaps puts people on notice that they shouldn't be blithely going forward with these securitizations. There's also the Clayton Holdings report, some of you may be familiar with, internal auditings at WAMU and other banks where it was clear they had done audits and they knew their underwriting standards were not up to snuff and didn't match what was in the disclosures. Judge Rakoff chastised the Assistant Attorney General for misstating the law on Frontline, where he had said that in every case he has to prove reliance. It's like, you don't have to prove reliance. Well, Lanny came back and said, well, I meant to say materiality. And then Judge Rakoff said, you know, they have the Attorney General Holder went before the Judiciary Committee and made this statement that, well, some of these banks are too big to prosecute, and, you know, maybe that's something Congress ought to look at. Well, we did look at it, and we argued that they were too big to fail and too big to prosecute. And, of course, he quickly had to backtrack on that when for me, that was just an ex post rationalization by the Attorney General made up on the cuff. And Judge Rakoff said, you know, the department is obsessively focused on prosecuting companies when they should be focusing on individuals. Here, we said that in every meeting we ever had. I mean, the Justice Department set up such a straw man that if we go after, we all know about Arthur Andersen. We know what happened in the wake of Enron. Arthur Andersen got obliterated, you know, and Lanny Brewer is giving speeches about how he's worried about the impact on innocent employees. Well, look, you know, you don't have to indict the firm as a firm. You can selectively target individuals. I got to give you one anecdote from Savannah because it's just too good. So, I mean, the First National Bank of Savannah, I learned when I moved down there, the local U.S. attorney indicted 7 executives, criminally indicted 7 executives. These are pillars of the community in Savannah. The bank failed, cost the FDIC tens of millions of dollars. And I thought, well, this is an interesting contrast to what's going on at the national level. Maybe I'll sit in on the trial. And I went to one of the lawyers, and, you know, she wouldn't tell me anything, but she said, you know, we're sticking together, the 7, where it's all going to be one joint trial, and, you know, we're not going to plea. It's going to go to trial. You really ought to sit in a trial. It'll be interesting. Well, one of the 7 flipped. And not long after, another one flipped. And then the dominoes all went down. All 7 have pled guilty. Now, I have no opinion on whether what they did was wrong or not wrong. But as the insider had said to me, sometimes you just have to start bringing indictments and the dominoes will start falling. So Judge Rakoff asks, what's really happening? The Justice Department has other priorities. Rightly so. After 9/11, a lot of resources were shifted over, and appropriately so, to counterterrorism. As you know, a lot of resources are being shifted today to cybercrime. And, of course, the Southern District of New York has been putting up some big numbers on insider trading cases, which have absolutely nothing to do with the financial crisis, but which are good cases, and we should applaud them for doing that. Now, recently, the FBI actually updated its mission statement. For the first time, the FBI's mission statement says national security, not law enforcement, is its primary mission. Now, the FBI has always been about chasing communists and everything, right? I don't want to be historically naive about that either. But when the FBI says it's all about national security and not law enforcement, that leaves a rather large hole in my view. Now, during this, I asked a friend of mine at the White House who used to work at the Justice Department, what's going on here? And he said, no one over there is making it a priority. The attitude starts at the top. Look at what Bernanke and Geithner's reaction was in 2008 when they became aware of LIBOR fraud for the first time. They didn't do anything about it other than send a memo to the Europeans. Geithner has said several things publicly, like the desire for Old Testament justice was understandable but counterproductive, that all the things people wanted to do would have been damaging to the system. It could have caused a run. So, in my words, in his utilitarian view, more people would benefit from the banking economy returning to health than from the disruptive effects of seeking accountability, apparently, even if that meant overlooking potential criminal behavior. Now, finally, we're still on the subject of priorities. After Obama's reelection, the Attorney General was quoted last year saying, "It's clearly a priority for the President, so I do a weekly call with the U.S. attorneys, and when they know they have to report the Attorney General every week, they make progress." Well, I suppose better late than never. That should have been going on from day one. We thought it was going on from day one. Second, Judge Rakoff said defendants could argue that the government policies made me do it, that the government was trying to promote housing. That was too vague for me. Here's what I think was going on. I think a lot of regulators were on the scene and had knowledge of what was happening inside these banks. So part of the defense could have been, look, we were doing Repo 105 and Fred over there at the SEC knew about it at Lehman Brothers. More importantly, and Elizabeth Warren has been hammering this in the Senate, is that bank regulators no longer think that it's their role to help with law enforcement. Thomas Curry, the head of the OCC, has said, quote, "It is not our role to avenge or to punish per se." In the aftermath of the savings and loan crisis, it was the Congress that got the regulatory agencies' cages rattled, and they started developing criminal referrals. A criminal referral is, like a 20-page memo with attachments, which is supposed to be, by the people who are closest to the substance of what went wrong, and that could be the roadmap for an FBI investigation. Well, a study by Syracuse University showed that in 1995, the OCC and other bank regulators provided 1,837 criminal referrals, while in 2006, that number had fallen to 76. Instead of criminal referrals, the OCC issues MRIs, matters requiring attention. It's like, well, your bank blew up and sent the world economy into recession. We think that's a matter requiring your attention. I mean, when we met, going back to 2009, with Attorney General Lanny Brewer, Assistant Attorney General, he said, "Jeff, we're dependent on the pipeline to bring us cases." Well, now we know there is no pipeline. You've got to go down into the culture of these bank regulatory agencies, and you have to get them back into the business of helping the FBI with criminal referrals. A third, Rakoff criticized the growth in deferred prosecution agreements. Again, this why aren't we focusing on individuals? And the whole theory about deferred prosecution is we're going to ramp up the internal compliance programs of these corporations, and that's really going to make a big difference. Well, my question to that is, how is compliance going to work when no one fears individual accountability under the law? I mean, I'll blow off the compliance department every time to get a bigger bonus if I don't think I'm going to jail if I break the law. In the final analysis, I really don't blame Attorney General Holder or Lanny Brewer. The buck stops with the president. Now, I'm going to do a little speculating here, but he was either completely passive when he didn't need to be in his first term. There's absolutely nothing wrong with the president saying to his attorney general, "Are you making the extraordinary effort that this situation requires with the resources, priority, and accountability to achieve a credible outcome for the American people?" Of course, the president shouldn't get involved in individual cases. As a senator, Ted never asked about an individual case. The role of Congress stops, with determining whether or not there are any systemic obstacles confronting the Justice Department, whether they have the resources they need. Or perhaps the president in early 2009 made a judgment. after listening to people like Bernanke and Geithner. It's true, the international banking system was on the precipice. Bernanke and Geithner came up and briefed the senators, and Ted said you could see the fear on their face. These credit default swaps and CDOs were turning up all over the world. They had no idea what the limit to this was to be. And maybe they believed, and Geithner's pretty much said it, all but said it, that one prosecutorial bull in that china shop could break too much glass. We needed the banks to recover so the economy could recover. The law is too blunt an instrument. The situation requires a light touch. I actually think Holder and Brewer had their ears cocked to the White House and that was at least the vibe that they got. And if they had gotten the exact opposite vibe, I think they would have done differently. But the president is the president. He sits behind the biggest desk and he makes judgments. And I think it was a false choice. I think we could have had the banks recover and the economy recover, and we still could have prosecuted individuals at the banks. I mean, we fired the heads of the auto companies. Didn't seem to slow down that comeback. So I don't know what really happened, and I don't claim in my book to know what really happened, but I do strongly believe that the transparency to everyone who's paying attention, that the Justice Department failures have had a shattering effect on trust in government and have created a belief that the system is rigged for the privileged few. Now, in closing, in August 2010, I knew I couldn't go back to being a lobbyist. Ted said, well, why don't we start a not-for-profit and we'll keep fighting for the rule of law and keep fighting to break up the big banks. And I said, Ted, I'll fight Wall Street, but I'm not going to fight Obama, Biden, regulators, and Wall Street. For me, it was a pogo moment. Ted, we have met the enemy, and the enemy is us. You know, we're going to lose if we keep fighting this battle on a hand-to-hand combat level. It was time for a strategic retreat. We need a citizen uprising, and Professor Lessig, I sincerely hope it starts with the New Hampshire Rebellion. Thank you.
So I'm going to keep a queue for questions, but let me take the privilege of the chair to ask the first. So I accept the characterization of the uncertainty and fear right at the time of 2009 that would have led to them saying, let's just not mess too much up here. But the more interesting question that Judge Rakoff and you have raised is the continuing refusal to take up the prosecutions, now coming up against the statute of limitations, so if we don't bring them up now, it's over. And so the question, well, what would account for that? And I was struck in Judge Rakoff's piece by a kind of elephant in the room that he just never even adverts to, which I characterize or summarize in three numbers: 51%, 47%, and 32%. Now, those are the percentages of contributions that Wall Street, FIRE, gave to the Democratic Party in 2008 and 2010 and 2012. And you could, I imagine you could well understand, even at the president's level, that, you know, if that number continues to fall from 32% to 20%, right, and the largest contributors in the congressional races are now spending all their money on the Republican side, that's the end to any hope that they would be in a position to be able to win any legislation. They'll lose both houses, right? So when you say they don't have the will to taking on Wall Street, I wonder whether the better way to characterize that is they just don't have the capacity or the independence or the ability and take on Wall Street, and then to be able to continue to maintain themselves as a competitive party in a world where Wall Street itself is the largest chunk of money in the congressional elections.
Well, I mean, I guess I'd answer that by saying two things. I thought the Justice Department had a commitment to enforcing the law.
Oh, now you're being naive.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
Well, look at oversight from the Judiciary Committee, which has never been particularly strong of the Justice Department when it's the party in power. I mean, since Ted left, I've watched every oversight hearing when Director Mueller or the Attorney General is there. No one's asking Holder on the Democratic side of the aisle. I mean, Blumenthal of Connecticut asked one question once. they're all like, well, do you need anything more on cybercrime? You know, yeah, give us your list. We'll give you everything you want on cyber. So I agree with you, the effect of, ooh, you know, we can't drive away Wall Street from the Democratic Party. You know, it's very hard to talk about people in Washington being affected by money. I mean, I'm very reluctant to paint with a broad brush, but you know, I've been very disappointed by what the Judiciary Committee's done. I talked to my friends who work there, and I was like, is there any will to hold the Justice Department's feet to the fire on this? Zero. Yeah, no, I think you're right.
Arthur. I'm sorry, so just to instructions, if you hold this while you're talking.
Okay, I got it. And I talk into this. Got it. So I may be misremembering Judge Rakoff's article in the New York Review of Books, but I recall that he spent a lot of time on a relatively more benign, I say relatively more benign explanation, which is that it's generally not in the career interests of individual prosecutors to engage in cases that are going to go on for a very long time and aren't going to finish while they're in the office. And as I wonder, just in your view, how much of the problem is an institutional design problem rather than a corruption from the top problem? Because I mean, here's what I mean, if what I'm about to say is true, then we really are lost. But I would imagine that if a U.S. attorney brought a case, it wouldn't be stopped from that the Justice Department wouldn't say, no, don't bring that prosecution. I do understand the explanation that it wasn't prioritized from the top, but what keeps all of these bright prosecutors in Manhattan from initiating these cases? And do you really think that they would have been taken to the woodshed and told, no, stay away from the CEO of?
No, I don't think that. I think, first of all, these are incredibly complicated cases that were extremely resource intensive. So what the effort needed from the beginning was a timely, all-in commitment that we're going to, and that's why this is what the bill was about, you know, giving them the additional resources to really staff up and say, we want you to spend years on this, we have your back, this is important. If you come back with a dry hole, don't worry, it's not going to affect your career. And the chief counsel, who had been a line prosecutor, said, don't worry, the line prosecutors, they know it would make their career if they bagged one of these big Wall Street heads. So I'm not saying anything about you know, the line prosecutors. But I do think, you know, when the Justice Department decided not to do this from a centralized approach, I mean, look at Enron. I mean, Enron, we had a well-staffed task force. When we interviewed at the hearing the deputy director of the FBI and said, where are the FBI agents who have knowledge about sophisticated financial crimes, he said, well, we have a cadre of them who worked on the Enron case, and we're going to have to build out from there. I mean, they were woefully understaffed. Yes, I have heard. I mean, it is a problem. And when you have young prosecutors leaving after 2 or 3 years, I mean, that's a very disruptive kind of thing, you know? And I'm not sure what the solution is to that, but I stand by my book. The leadership didn't try, you know?
Yep.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. I think great presentation. I miss the old little microphones with the little crimson-colored plastic rings. But you know, newer versions. I happen to be from Delaware, so I have a special appreciation for Ted. I want to ask you about a couple of things. There's a lot in what you said that's, you know, very interesting. But I want to ask you, because I'm from Delaware in part, if you want to say anything about Joe Biden, and if you want to say anything about his relationship with MBNA, which became the biggest, superseded DuPont as the biggest employer in Delaware, and Biden's role in the bankruptcy, so-called bankruptcy reform legislation, and how that might fit in a general way, or maybe even, and then the second thing is a little bit of another little dimension of the Obama story, which I don't want to overstate, but Obama was a graduate of the Harvard Law School, presumably had relations of a more special nature with Larry Summers and Robert Rubin that may have added to the more sort of material dimensions that I think you've been focusing on. And I want to mention one thing about Rubin. Rubin, who is a member of the Harvard Corporation, got what some people have referred to as the Enron seat on the Harvard Corporation. The reason why it's been called that is because his predecessor, Herbert Pug Winokur, a member of the Harvard Corporation, was also on the finance committee of Enron and arranged for short-selling Enron stock for what some believe ended up being $150 million of profit for the Harvard's endowment. So maybe there's even more to it than we realize.
Well, I've kind of gone about as far as I can go in the speculation category, but look, Delaware's biggest employer are the credit card banks. And that led the Wilmington News Journal editor to say to me once, Ted Kaufman going after the banks, if that's not news, I don't know what news is. And the Wilmington News Journal was actually very supportive of Ted. But Ted also said, I have this little parentheses with DE after my name. I do represent Delaware. And there were times when we too helped on particular banking issues because there are 35,000 people in Delaware who depend on it for a living. I would tell you the Delaware powers were extremely upset with Ted. He was walking into the hardware store and people were loving him. They were like, "Go, Ted." But you know what Delaware is, and frankly, I think it's a corporate governance issue for study here at Harvard Law School. The whole state thrives on filing fees, and it's basically the state is a lobbyist for corporate America on corporate governance issues because it's their bread and butter.
Hi, well, it's loud. Thanks for coming. My name is Danny Kramer. I'm a junior at the college. I had a question regarding a point you made near the middle of your talk regarding technocratic arrogance. I think the question of objective competency in these situations is a very valuable one, mostly in, at least for me, its difficulty to answer. And competency, either feigned or misdirected, is a serious contributor to the issues you've spoken on. But I'm kind of wondering, how do you define competent? Like in your book, what would make someone competent to have to hold a regulatory position? And then assuming that you can actually codify that, how do you prevent it from being subverted?
Well, look, I spent 4 years on Wall Street. I've got a Chicago MBA with a specialization in finance. Ted has a Wharton MBA in finance. He started his career at DuPont in finance. He's been an active investor for 50 years. So, we weren't cowed. And we took the position, yes, these are complex issues, but it's not impossible for people to learn them. So you've got this big problem. You've got people, it's like, well, the only people who understand Wall Street issues are Wall Street people, so the banking committee hires from Wall Street and nowhere else. And, I'd like to see, it's very hard to break that cycle. It just is. And again, I think if Ted were standing here, he would say, the revolving door is really a big problem because people assume that unless you have industry experience, you can't possibly know what you're doing.
Well, in connection with that, if I could add a follow-up, what role do you think academic institutions could play in that, considering the pretty ambiguous history of business and finance in the educational world?
We spent a lot, I went to the University of Chicago. I know what empiricism is. I know we're supposed to base everything on data. The problem is, and we had this conversation with Mary Shapiro at the SEC, all the data is controlled by Wall Street. It used to be that academics did play a role as an objective, empirical, I think the So's bandits manipulation of NASDAQ in the 20 years ago was broken by academics. But the problem is there's no access to the data. Harvey Pitt, former SEC chairman, who was actually very helpful to us, said to me and said publicly, one of the most important things the SEC could do is collect a lot of data. Maybe you have to time delay it, maybe you have to mask it for proprietary interests, and then put all that data back out to the public. So everybody, could have their shot at turning the data. Now the SEC is trying to do that to a limited degree with this new PRISM system that they bought from a high-frequency trader, but I actually went and saw that demoed, and I was all for it. I mean, the SEC is living in a stone age. I mean, they have to get more technically competent. So yes, I do think there's a role for academics, but I also was recently quoted saying academics are now hired guns like everyone else. I mean, Wall Street's out there hiring people left and right. I mean, when I was a lobbyist, I'd call an academic and say, what do you think of this particular issue I'm confronting? And the first thing they'd say, most of the time, was, is this a retainer situation? You know? And look, I had my umbrella turned upside down too, okay? So, it's just, this is the problem. I mean, I was even going to say to the professor while I was here, I mean, even if you did enact campaign finance reform, that's not going to stop the corporate shower. I mean, it will certainly disempower, drain the swamp somewhat for lobbyists and make lobbyists play less of a role. But there still is going to be decision-making happening in I mean, they'll go out and hire, we used to call it the future pallbearers, who are the friends of the senator who's going to carry him to his grave. We need to influence those people so they can influence the senator. They'll go out and hire the future pallbearers.
Yep. Brooke.
I'm Brooke Williams. I'm an investigative reporter. I'm wondering how think tanks fit into this blob, specifically Beltway think tanks. What are the strategies that are most effective in making sure that Wall Street wins?
Well, let's take the GAO study right now about whether the too big to fail banks actually enjoy a measurable subsidy because the market perceives them as too big to fail. I've been in as a lobbyist to meet with the GAO. They are being, they've been authorized by the Senate to come back with this report, and Simon Johnson and other people say, look, the banks are being subsidized to the tune of 60, 70, 80 basis points because they're perceived as too big to fail. So the banks are just, all they have to do is muddy the waters of what is the weight of expert opinion, and they've almost won. I mean, I've predicted long ago that the GAO will not come down with like, here's our view, it's this. It's like, well, there are 3 different ways to look at it. If you measure it this way, it's nothing. If you measure it this way, it's 20 basis points. And if you do it the way Simon wants us to do it, it's 65. I mean, they just won't take a stand because they're being inundated by think tanks, telling them how to go about measuring this. So I think, there's always been a battle of the experts. But there have been a couple of articles written in Washington lately about the sort of so-called growth of soft lobbying. I mean, it's no, I used to have 35 clients, and I could get relatively expert in issues, but, I can't make as effective of an argument as, oh, look at the so-and-so think tank. Look at the reports they're putting out. And let me make this point. I mean, the D.C. Circuit is requiring evidence-based rulemaking. I mean, they just swatted down net neutrality because of the FCC. The SEC is so concerned about being able to show the cost-benefit analysis under these rules. I didn't even know that the SEC is subject to a higher showing because of something else that was passed during the final year of the Clinton administration. So you've got, it's a 3-front battle. I mean, the banks are trying to win in the courts, win with the regulators, and win in Congress. And academics and think tanks and experts and building this body of evidence that the D.C. Circuit's going to weigh and say, well, I don't think you've justified this rule. I mean, to me, it's just bizarre. The Congress has actually considered the situation, has passed a law. The SEC is supposed to interpret and write rules to implement the law, and the D.C. Circuit says this is not justified under a cost-benefit analysis. Well, the Congress justified it by deciding to do it. This is a very big fight in the D.C. Circuit right now, which Justice Scalia's son is winning, hands down, and it's very concerning. And it's the reason why the Senate said, we're ending the filibuster. We need 3 more Democratic appointees on the D.C. Circuit. There is no way we're going to leave the D.C. Circuit limited to 8 judges.
I want to follow up on this question of the structure of regulation. We had Bob Kaiser here last year talking about his book, which of course is a very extensive account of the Dodd-Frank book. Obviously you are. And one of the questions I put to him was, wouldn't the banks have wanted Dodd-Frank to have the particular architecture that it did, where 90% of the really substantive issues are going to be determined by rulemaking, and rulemaking is a context in which they will flood the field, and and it was as if he just didn't even think anybody was thinking like that. Like he kind of reacted like, geez, I don't think anybody was strategizing. It was just that it was too hard for Congress to solve. But you said, I quoted you, I wrote you down saying, it just played, quote, into the hands of Wall Street.
Right.
So do you believe that Wall Street was there thinking, here's the best way for us to make lemonade out of these lemons, that if we create a situation where there are 465 rules, we will spend the next decade?
I think it's the cycle of arguing against the rule. I mean, first they try to, you need more exceptions, you need more definitions, you need more of this, you need more of that, you need to define this more precisely, and then the next thing you know, they argue the whole damn thing is way too complex, And, Frank, Ted was the biggest critic of Dodd-Frank on the Democratic side. I mean, I don't defend Dodd-Frank. I mean, now it is the law. It's the best thing we've got. So, I mean, I like the people who are trying to get it implemented. But, Ted thought the Volcker Rule was not a particularly effective idea from the beginning because you don't even know. Or, yes, we all know that in the aftermath of the crisis, the regulators are chastened and they're focusing on this more, and maybe they're not quite as captured as they usually are. But who's going to be the next president? Who is he going to appoint as regulators? I mean, we met at the New York Fed with Bill Dudley, the president of the New York Fed, and he said, look, we know what the answer is. We have to increase capital requirements on a proportional basis as these banks get bigger, and that'll give them the incentive to either limit their size or shrink. Don't worry, we're on it. We're going to coordinate it at the international level. We don't need this to be in statute. And Ted said, okay, that's great. I've only got one question. What happens when Larry Kudlow gets elected president? I mean, you can't tell me that this is going to be the view 10 or 15 years ago. So, of course, it plays into the bank's hands. One of the metaphors we used in a TED speech is that this is like dancing the tango. I mean, right now the regulators are in the lead, but eventually when we all stop paying attention, the banks will turn and they'll be in the lead coming back. And, yes, it's expensive, and Jamie Dimon was quoted the other day saying these regulators are relentless. It's like the mafia. I mean, it's just like, it's nickels to them.
Nichols. Okay, do we have another question, because we're coming up on our time? So please join me. Oh, I'm sorry, right here. Last question. If you just hold that down while you're speaking, then it'll be the bottom. Yeah, that's it.
Like that? Thank you. Are there any? Could Bitcoin be an example of a disruptive technology that might be able to shrink the financial resources being channeled through Wall Street?
I know the libertarians and the anti-Fed people think Bitcoin has promise. I frankly haven't been following it. I mean, I just, I know a lot of people are upset about it. I know some people think it's a way around central bank control. As I said at the beginning, I'm sort of conflicted on this because I've been benefiting from quantitative easing for the last few years. So I really don't have a view on Bitcoin.
Okay, please join me in thanking Jeff Connaughton. That was great. Really great.